The European Union has slammed Israel for its demolition drive in the occupied Palestinian territory, saying the Israeli move risks undermining the viability of a future Palestinian state. In a statement, the EU diplomatic service has called on Tel Aviv to halt the demolition of Palestinian houses, some of which were funded by the EU itself. The statement follows the demolition of several Palestinian homes south of the city of Al-Khalil, also known as Hebron. The Israeli action last week left at least 80 people from 12 families homeless. Meanwhile, the 28-nation bloc has also reiterated its opposition to the Israeli settlement expansion. The EU statement referred to Israel's decision to grab 380 acres of more Palestinian land in order to build new settler units. Palestinians say their ancestors had lived on the land long before Israel's occupation of the West Bank in 1948.
As part of Israel's ongoing attempts to claim as much land as possible in the occupied territories, the Israeli troops demolished dozens of Palestinian-owned structures in Jerusalem, Al-Quds and in Area C of the occupied West Bank. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Occupied Palestinian Territories, OCHA, revealed that 42 Palestinian-owned structures have been completely demolished for not having Israeli-issued building construction permits. The Israelis plan to use the lands as army training zones.
The Israeli troops have been targeting 3 areas, Jerusalem, Al-Khalil and the Jordan Valley. The Israeli authorities claim the houses are usually built without license in Jerusalem. In Area C, Israel wants to expel people so as to use the land for military purposes or for annexing them to settlements.
Based on OCHA's report, 168 Palestinians, 94 of them children, were displaced. Meanwhile, the European Union has denounced the move, saying 10 of the buildings demolished in Khirbet Jinba, south of Al-Khalil, had been constructed with funds from the European Commission's humanitarian arm. EU also said the evacuation is a forced uprooting of a protected population.
The issue of the ongoing demolition of the homes is simply related to the fact that Israel wants to grab land after demolishing the homes as part of Israel's plan to expand the settlements.
Human rights groups have repeatedly challenged Israel's claim to the land, arguing it's illegal to establish a military zone in the occupied territory. This time, dozens of Palestinian homes were being demolished by Israeli forces to make way for military training zones. This shows that Palestinian people are losing the legal battle they have been waging for years to prevent such unfortunate accidents from happening. Mona Qandil for PressTV, occupied Ramallah.
Well, to discuss that further, we're now joined by Mr. Gearóid Ó Colmáin, who is an author and journalist, and he's joining us live now via Skype from Paris. And Mr. Colmáin, it seems that the EU is still holding on to what many people have already said will not be possible, and that is, of course, 2 states. How do you feel about that?
Well, the notion of 2 states is really a non-starter. There's very little Palestinian land left to start with, so there really is no possibility of a viable Palestinian state at this stage. One should understand that the Israeli state, the Zionist entity, is a state without any official borders. It has no constitution. So it has constantly been an expansion since its inception in 1948. And it needs to expand. It still is quite a small state, but if you look at its global reach, it's quite significant. It's probably this, in terms of geographical territory, it has enormous power over other states and has enormous influence over major powers like the United States, France, Britain, and European powers. So when the Israeli state expands, and it's continually expanding, it does so with impunity, and it has violated all known UN resolutions on this. There have been numerous resolutions against Israel, yet there's never been any sanctions imposed on Israel. It's a state, of course, with nuclear weapons, and yet it goes around trying to drum up support for bombing of other states, for developing nuclear energy for civilian purposes, like Iran, for example. So Israel really, if you were to look at Israel objectively, the only way you could describe Israel is it's a rogue state, but it has enormous international clout And so that is why the EU is incapable of stopping the continuous colonization of Palestinian land. We should also understand that the wars that we're seeing in the region right now, the war in Syria, for example, the destabilization and destruction of Libya, the Arab Spring itself, are all part of the Israeli expansion agenda in the Middle East, which aims to destabilize all Arab countries contiguous to Israel, so as to create the conditions for the expansion of Israeli power in the region and the emergence of Greater Israel as a hegemonic power in the region and in the world. And so the continual war against the Palestinians should not be disconnected from the war against Syria, which is being waged by a proxy force referred to as the Islamic State. But the Islamic State is nothing but the Foreign Legion of Israel, a Foreign Legion of the United States, which is very much controlled and directed by Israel through its lobby. So we should not disconnect these things. I think one of the tragedies of the occupation of Palestine is that the Israelis have, through their control of these Arab regimes of the Gulf, I'm referring to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, through their control of these regimes, they've managed to co-opt a lot of the forces fighting Israel in Palestine, such as Hamas. And so there is the result of that is that there is no coherent opposition to Israel. The real oppositional forces to Israel in the Middle East right now, there are two main oppositional forces. That is the Syrian Arab Army and Hezbollah, supported by Iran. These are the only real anti-Zionist forces in the Middle East right now. In Palestine itself, Hamas have been very much co-opted by Qatar and by the Israelis. So that has very much strengthened Israel's force in the region and has rendered resistance almost futile. So that's something that really needs to be addressed here.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there at that point. But of course, we do appreciate, as always, you putting that all into context for us. That was Mr. Gearóid Ó Colmáin, who had been speaking to us live from the French capital.